Okay. Welcome everybody to the fourth and final for the summer of 2020 Lunch and Learn with the Valley Forge Park Alliance. The Tredyffrin Public Libraries are very happy and proud to be partnering with the Valley Forge Alliance for another summer. We are also sort of partnering with the Tredyffrin Easttown Historical Society and the King of Prussia Historical Society to bring in a broader audience to share this wonderful information about Valley Forge Park and to share our local history. I'd like to pass this on to Molly Duffy, who's with the Valley Forge Park Alliance, to tell you a little bit about that organization. Molly?
Thanks, Marianne. I first want to thank you and the Tredyffrin Library for making this possible, because I think this is probably our most well-attended lunch and learn ever. So it's not all bad doing things virtually, as it turns out. And I also want to thank Justin, who's presenting for us today, who has drawn this huge crowd over this very interesting topic. So for those of you who might not know the Valley Forge Park Alliance, we're the nonprofit partner for Valley Forge National Historical Park. And just generally, I really do want to thank you all for your support. We couldn't do a program like this or anything we do without all of our members. So thank you so much. You really make this possible, truly. And if you're not a member and you love the park, I suggest you join the Alliance. So it's really the best way that you can help Valley Forge Park, the park that we all love so much. So thanks for joining us, and I'm going to turn this over to Justin. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you. All right.
Oh.
All right. All right. All right. Well, thank you for this opportunity to speak, both the Park Alliance and Tredyffrin Libraries. This is a talk that I've wanted to do for a little while, and this is a very good venue for it. It's not exactly conducive to have a lot of visuals during tours, so this can be a bit fun. But I want to talk about what this talk is and what it is not. So this is not part of a body of original research that I'm compiling, and it is also not some collection of secret archaeological evidence that is classified or kept away from the public through Valley Forge National Historical Park. They have to keep some things from the public just because they have to prevent looters potentially from destroying archaeological sites. So everything that this talk is based on are either primary source written documents or archaeological evidence that is in the public domain that is already published. So very important things to quickly make note of. All right. And now the process of building structures for troops, housing troops, is not something new to the American Revolution. I've included this image from Crown Point. This is during the 7 Years' War. This is in upstate New York, just because it features a variety of interesting structures. You see huts, the rows of tents, these weird projections here. These are actually stumps, but you see that there are some structures that look more like lean-tos. Other structures, these are either brush huts or perhaps they're covering over a tent, with brush. It's for insulation purposes. It's difficult to say, but there's a variety of different structures here, brush huts and so on. And on the end here, we have something that looks a little bit more like a Native American longhouse. This is probably what you call a wigwam. Most likely has a bark roof. So it's interesting to see this variety of different housing opportunities for the troops rather than just having them in tents. Now we have to be careful with the use of the word hut because it comes up in letters and orderly books and journals all the time. But when you see the word hut, it doesn't necessarily mean hut like we're accustomed to at Valley Forge. So if you look at Wilmington, the encampment at Wilmington, just prior to Valley Forge, they talk about building huts and sleeping inside huts. But what they're describing these are brush huts. right? So this is from the Xavier Delegata painting, The Battle of Paoli. And this is Wayne's division. They had camped in brush huts. Simple structures constructed of brush. You can build one in a matter of a few hours. You're just using hatchets and cutting down, whatever brush is found locally in the woods. So these can be made really quickly, and that's different from the huts that we see more at Valley Forge. Now, there's a bit of disagreement whether or not it was a good idea to encamp the army in huts. Many of you may be familiar with this, but there was a debate going on whether it was healthy, whether it was conducive to the health of the soldiers to live inside these huts. So from these two quotations, you can see that there is an argument among the senior staff of the Continental Army under General George Washington. Now, they're looking at two alternatives towards the end, either camping and entirely in a city of huts, or to perhaps go to Wilmington, Delaware, right? Wilmington, there are a lot of buildings there. You can potentially find winter quarters there. And it is traditional for European armies to divide up their forces during the winter into these separate winter garrisons, into the towns and villages and hamlets and small cities, because you can find existing buildings and structures in these places. And you can either occupy abandoned buildings, perhaps by loyalists who have fled, or rent out buildings that are owned by people living in these areas. And you can make up the shortage, of course, by building huts, just on a very small basis. And this is what the Army has done the last 2 years. But they want to remain close to Philadelphia in order to keep an eye on the British there. This is the capital of the United States. It's the capital of the state of Pennsylvania. Right? In the Pennsylvania State Assembly, they desperately want it back. So Washington is charged with staying in a very tight radius to that city. So that's not really a good idea to divide up your troops into smaller garrisons, right? If you're a single night march away from Philadelphia, right, 20 miles away or so, well, the British could potentially surprise a small garrison and take it, right? This is what happened at the Battle of Trenton, where the Continental Army crossed the Delaware River and captured the Hessian garrison there, because General Sir William Howe had divided up his British and Hessian forces throughout New Jersey. So staying that close to Philadelphia, they didn't have the luxury of dividing up into smaller winter quarters. So this is where you take 12,000 people, an entire city's worth of people, who arrive overnight in one location in the middle of plowed farm fields, and they have to build winter housing for an entire city. This is the 5th largest city in the United States at this point when they arrive. So that gives you an idea of the scale of this thing. Now, Valley Forge, of course, one of the opportunities for it, it made an ideal location because of the topography, this natural ridge line, of course, for the defense, the Schuylkill River as well. But there is a lot of available lumber in these hills, like on Mount Joy. These hills are not very conducive to agriculture, so that's why there are a lot of trees that are available for them to cut down. So part of the choice in picking Valley Forge was the availability of lumber. Now, the huts are also organized according to the proper discipline of a camp. It's the science of organizing military encampments is called castramentation, right? So the castramentation of a military encampment, this is a good example of that. And you have the quarter guard and the bells of arms holding the muskets in the front of the encamp. You have the rows of tents with the sergeant's tents on the ends, the field officers behind that, then the brigade or division officers beyond that. And then you have the camp kitchens where they're cooking their food. Sometimes you have sutleries, and the privies, the vault, where soldiers do their business. That is going to be outside the camp somewhat, either far to the rear of the camp or maybe ahead of the quarter guard by a quarter mile or so, because you want to keep the soldiers healthy and away from that. Now, this is an example where you see that castramentation of the camp with the Continental Army. It's 3 rows of tents. Again, behind that, the field officers, and behind that, maybe a colonel or brigade commander beyond that. So they're organizing their tents in this military fashion, and they do the same thing with brush huts and also with huts for winter quarters as well. Now, we see this a little bit with some of the archaeology that has gone on. Here at Maxwell's Brigade, you can see that there you have 2 rows of huts. They're neatly spaced out. The dimensions of the huts somewhat closely follow the dimensions and general orders. Diary entries describe them as 16 by 18 feet. The archaeology bears this out somewhat. Interestingly, you can see that one of them has a chimney in the corner. So that is something that we're going to follow up on. These are from 1962 excavations. Unfortunately, a lot of these early excavations, they didn't record the depth of the floors, which is a very useful data point that tells us a lot. Yeah. Now, one of the other aspects we see with the huts is the dovetail joint versus the saddle notch. The saddle notch is what we've used predominantly at Valley Forge with the reconstructions. Now, in the early 20th century and even the late 19th century, there are these accounts of people coming across some of the wooden rails from these huts that were surviving. And they sometimes recovered these rails, and one of them survived in someone's attic until the 1930s. So you do have this institutional memory within the Valley Forge State Park, where there was this difference in the 2 different types of notches. And again, the dovetail notch, because it comes to a point, as long as you preserve this angle, it doesn't matter what size log you have, it'll always fit. Whereas the saddle notch, you have to be a little bit more careful. The saddle notch, the curvature of that notch has to be individually carved to fit the particular size of the rail underneath it. So there is an advantage to doing it one way versus the other. If you have a saw, you're definitely going to be doing the dovetail notch instead of the saddle notch. But it's just to let the public know that there is a bit of variation in terms of the hut construction. And that is really the purpose of this talk, just bringing to the public information that you may not be aware of, that is known throughout the park with staff and volunteers, but is not widely known with the public at large. So here we have an idealized reconstruction of the hut. So this would probably be very familiar for most people. And the hut, it corresponds loosely to the general orders laying out the dimensions for the hut. And again, this is an idealized reconstruction. Now, the first thing that we have to keep in mind is that they're cutting down every tree in sight. 12,000 people will trample down any kind of vegetation that is there. They're also digging up the soil to use the clay and mud for the chinking between the logs. These are already on plowed farm fields in many cases. So you're not going to see a lot of grass, right? So what we're going to do throughout this talk is to show some of the various differences and changes that you might see with the huts. I'd also like to say that I welcome questions throughout. I very much like to have a conversation rather than just sit here and lecture at you. So if at any point you have any questions, please go to the chat dialogue, enter your questions in there, and those will be communicated to me, and I can address them as we go. So please feel free to ask questions. Now, with the huts, we have some examples of the chimney. This is called cat and clay chimneys. Here are 2 historical examples. They're built on a stone foundation. In Wayne's Woods, many of the huts recovered there from archaeology, they do have more of a stone foundation than you do in the Muhlenberg brigades or the Virginia brigades, or even Maxwell's or Conway's brigades, because it's just the availability of stone. Now, the orders were given to have 18 inches of clay or mud lining the chimneys to prevent these from catching fire. But you'll notice with these that the higher up you go, the smaller the logs get. I particularly like this 19th century print with a barrel kind of topping off this one chimney. But the reason for this is simple. They don't have ladders. It's not like they're building ladders at the same time they're building huts. So the lighter logs are going to go up top. So that shouldn't be any surprise. It's just human nature. Now, so if we take our hut and we replace the chimney, well, that cat and clay chimney might be replaced with one with smaller huts the further up it goes. The same thing goes with the hut itself, right? You're going to see smaller logs the higher up you go, because it's harder to lift things, especially without modern ropes and the availability of ropes and ladders that we have today. Now, going a little bit further, when we look at the roof, right, this is a shingled roof, and the shingles here, it's lightweight, which is good, but there is a shortage of nails, right? Iron nails are hard to come by, and so as a result, they're coming up with some unique ways of fixing down the shingles of that roof. Joseph Plum Martin, a private in the Continental Army, he describes this, and he says they're bound on by a straight pole and withes. So withes are simply, green sticks that are split or cut away into strips, or even small vines, anything that you can find like this that is green and flexible that they can use to tie. Right, so they're using this to lash down any of those shingles, or staves as he calls them, because they're a bit longer, maybe some of them at 4 feet in length, I think he says. So if we take this, what does this look like if we're fixing those with those straight poles? So here's an example, right? So you have these poles, and it's applying vertical pressure, and it is also applying pressure from keeping those tiles from slipping, right? So you see the post at this base, which is resting on that log. Those shingles are resting against it, and so on. Each one, they have this pole that they're resting on from slipping further, and you have that vertical pressure as well, and they're all lashed down with those withes. So this is one of the most common roofing methods that the Continental Army likely applied, right? If they're going to be building anything with shingles, then those shingles are going to be held down in this fashion. Now, a lot of this is the scarcity of tools, right? When the British Army swept in just a week after the Battle of Brandywine, and that small supply depot kept at Valley Forge, they destroyed a lot of food, a couple thousand barrels of flour and so on, but they also destroyed hundreds of barrels of other supplies, including barrels of iron nails that they could have used. So those are gone. A lot of tools were destroyed or captured by the British. And so that is one of the difficulties they have. If you have a hut that is entirely built using an axe, well, you have a problem, because of these shingles, right? You first need to cut a length of lumber into segments of 4 feet or smaller before you can begin splitting them into either slabs or small slates or shingles. So without a saw, cutting those into lengths first, well, it's very difficult to make this style of roof. So if you only have axes and not access to saws, you might come up with a different roofing solution. One of them potentially is a thatched roof, right? So this is an option. They're using whatever material is on hand, hay or straw. You're going to want to use that for bedding or feed for cattle or horses, using the Army transports. But if there's any kind of green scrub, any kind of thing that you can lash together and use, this is potentially an option, something like or resembling a thatched roof.
Just one question that came in.
Yes.
I thought Joseph Plum Martin spent most of Valley Forge encampment in Downingtown. Did they have the same type of huts there, or were they in houses?
Good question. First, I used a quote from Joseph Plum Martin, written during the encampment at Morristown, New Jersey, in the winter of 1779 to 1780. It is one of the most descriptive quotes we have, and it equally applies to the huts at Valley Forge, where they had a shortage of nails. But to answer the question more directly, Martin wintered at Downingtown, Pennsylvania. As I mentioned earlier, small garrison towns would have structures available to rent, including space in houses or other buildings. But they typically had to supplement available housing with construction of huts. So in Downingtown, you would see huts such as this, as well as soldiers quartered in civilian households. Essentially, you would have a combination.
And another question about how long would it take to build a hut?
So it varies because some seem to have built a hut within a week, but it takes a long time for the entire army to get settled into huts. So you may have people sleeping in these before they've fixed a roof on. You may have them helping each other out, and once one hut is finished, those tools become available, and so on. So getting the whole army hutted is something that's going to take a few weeks. So it does go into January, even though they first marched in on December 19th, 1777.
And how much of the forest was cut down in making the huts?
Yeah, there are a lot of different quotes on that. They are cutting wood as far out as a 3-mile radius. And I have at times taken that idea to the extreme that, within a mile or mile and a half, that they had cut down every single tree in sight within a mile, within that small radius. But we do have some accounts of walking in the woods close to Valley Forge. So one French officer encountered Colonel Lewis Cook. He's a St. Regis Mohawk who attended the encampment with the Oneida, and he encountered him while walking in the woods. So there had to be some timber in the area that was not completely cut down. Now, going back to the roofing solutions, we also have this description of slabs, and the word staves could mean, longer shingles, described similar to Joseph Lamartin. But they may also be these long split slabs where you just split, a piece of lumber lengthwise, and this becomes what you use for your roof. So this is what's described in general orders, the split slabs. And this is perhaps what that would look like, where you have these logs split, laid horizontally, they're overlapping each other. You can pack some mud or clay into the joints. Here I interpreted pegs holding them down, mostly because it's hard to Photoshop the widths. But they could easily use the widths as well. That would prevent them from having to drill holes for pegs. I replaced the door as well because boards are hard to come by. There are mills within the area. They're trying to get lumber, either cut boards or that may be available. Pennypacker Mills, a few miles away, there are carts and wagons bringing some of those boards over to the encampment, and they can use those for doors. But again, it's few and far between. Most of the doors are held together in this fashion. If they didn't peg them, potentially they could use a few nails. There's one account that says there are only 5 to 6 nails per hut, and those are in the door. There are also nails recovered archaeologically at a lot of these sites. So there are nails available, but again, it's not what they're primarily relying upon for construction of these shelters. You have some people that said that there's not a nail in the single hut. We have an account that describes that. But these, of course, there's going to be a lot of gaps in these slab style roofs. So they could pack clay into them, but if clay is hard to come by, one other option is using sod, right? So sod might look like this. And there are several accounts describing sod being put over these slab roofs. And in subsequent years, like the very next winter of 1778 to 79, you have orders going out saying, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of Valley Forge. The illnesses that arise from dampness when you have sod as part of your roof. So we know that they were doing things like this because they just didn't want that sod to be used in future years. So there is a lot of illness, and the illness, one big part of that is the dampness. Now, there are various solutions when it came to building these. One thing you see as well is that they're digging down. If you can dig down 3 feet, that's 3 feet less you have to build upward. You save on labor, you save on lumber. And there's this added benefit that if you can dig below the frost line, there's a stabilization of temperature, and it's actually going to be a bit warmer than it might otherwise be. The only difficulty with that is, again, the dampness, right? So in subsequent years, you have orders not to do something like this. Right, here's a depiction of what it might be like to have a hut that with a sunken floor, where, they've basically cut a basement or a cellar, and, they're building a roof above this. So in this interpretation, I have some fascine bundles, these bundles of sticks holding back the earth. And there are a lot of suggestions in the primary accounts that something like this happened. Now, Thomas Paine, when he visited the army, the political pamphleteer, he described the army. He said it reminded him of a family of beavers. So to me, that conjures up the image of a beaver dam. And so I kind of like this image of, a hut very close to the ground, very narrow. I guess it does give you that idea. And it's kind of fun to look at the different options. Now, we do have accounts that describe that they were first building up the wall 6 feet or so. We have plenty of accounts that describe a gabled roof, but we don't know if that's the only option. There could be a lean-to style roof, which is just a single roof slanted in one direction. If you remember the images from Crown Point I had at the very beginning. So we have to imagine that all these huts, there could be a wide variety of roofing solutions, a wide variety of the joints, whether it's a dovetail or a saddle notch, a wide variety of which way they're oriented, and so on. You can save on labor if you put that door on the corner. You don't have to saw these pieces of timber into two, right? You could potentially just form a crude door in the corner, or even throw the chimney in a corner, and you can save on labor instead of having to kind of cut more logs to create an opening. So there is archaeological evidence for chimneys that are cut into corners, for doors that are positioned in corners as well. So I'm trying to get you to imagine the wide variety of different huts that you might have seen throughout Valley Forge. And it would differ from brigade to brigade. If you remember that image from Maxwell's brigade, it was pretty regimented. Those huts were nice even rows. They're all is a uniform size, but that's not the case all throughout the encampment.
How many huts were built, and what types of illnesses were at Valley Forge, which it looks like you're going to talk about next?
Orders specified 12 men per hut for the soldiers. That's a single mess group. So these are the people who cook together, sleep together, rotate guard duty amongst themselves, etc. For officers' huts, one primary source describes 2 corps of officers belonging to a single hut. That may mean 2 officers with their batmen or waiters attending, but it could also mean 2 sets of officers belonging to a single company. Each set or each corps of officer perhaps including a captain, a lieutenant, and an ensign. So depending on how you interpret the description, it could be 2 officers per hut, or it could be as many as 6 officers plus potentially any accompanying private soldiers serving as waiters. So let's do the math. If we take the January 19th, 1778 return, there were approximately 15,159 soldiers present in camp, both fit and unfit for duty. That number includes officers, NCOs, and rank and file soldiers. So every colonel got their own hut. We can add those up already. For other field officers, if we assume 2 men per hut, we may have around 643 officer huts. If there are 13,902 NCOs and rank and file soldiers, that may add up to an additional 1,159 huts. Of course, we have to include the flying hospitals within camp. Every division and every brigade had its own hospital hut. So already we're totaling around 1,830 huts. But we haven't added huts for artificers or wagoners. Add to that storage huts with the commissary or quartermaster departments. So in the end, we may have around 2,000 huts total. That's a rough estimate overall.
And remember, there are a wide variety of these. They might be using them for storage. And we don't really know about the women that are with the encampment. You know, the 800 or so or more women that are with the encampment, are they with the soldiers sharing the same space? So that number of 12, are there women on top of that number sharing the same space? Were some of them able to have their own structures built? So a lot of questions, a lot of possibilities that we just don't know about. Now, in terms of disease, you have typhoid, dysentery, typhus, these communicable camp diseases. And part of the problem is that you have, these unsanitary conditions. The damp isn't helping any, but they're also tracking a lot of mud into, these huts. If they're low to the ground, like this 19th century historical example, they're prone to flooding.
And
now,
another
yes.
hut structure question. Was the ground rocky enough to provide the stone for so many foundations and fireplaces?
Yeah, you do see enough stone with Wayne's and Wayne's Woods, the brigades that are stationed there. You do not see that so much with the Virginia regiments. And this is depicting archaeology from there, these excavations during the 1970s. And here the stone is, you might have a single layer, in the hearth, but you don't have a lot of stone. You're not going to see it around the foundation of the hut. In fact, sometimes the only evidence you have of that wall is the discoloration in the soil from that log that is rotted away. Was there a second question?
That's it for now.
Okay. Now, I'd like to draw attention to this. If you have this idea of, these nice, neat rows of huts, then this image might really surprise you. Now, we don't know the precise locations of Muhlenberg's or Whedon's brigades. So this one, the archaeologists refer to it as the Virginia Brigade site, as it's either one or the other. And I'll use that same term. So with this Virginia Brigade site, they'll be pretty surprising for many to see you don't have these nice, neat rows. There aren't 3 rows of huts. It's just haphazard. In fact, the closest thing we get to any kind of structure is that maybe there are these streets, perhaps, in this opening here, and with these huts facing in that direction. But the way I like to think of it is, well, you can almost see who was the last person to build a hut. Like if someone had like a pile of soil or a pile of sticks or logs in one location, then this guy had to build around it, and it couldn't easily have the chimney facing to the rear, as there's a pile of logs in the way. Who knows? But I think just the haphazard formation of these huts is probably reflective of all the material they're bringing in and dumping in place, and people are trying to build around them. The other thing I'd like to point out are these pits, pits 1, 2, 3, and 4. These actually, that pit looks to be inside one of the huts. But there are these accounts of the soldiers relieving themselves in the company streets, and there are orders going out again and again forbidding the men from doing so and having harsh punishments if they're caught doing so. But then you see an order coming out where they're allowing people to dig pits in the encampment close to the huts and for men to do their business, and they cover it over with soil twice a day. And the reason why they start doing this is, the men who are relieving themselves in the company streets, they probably were too weak to make it to the vault, you know, the big trench cut just outside the camp to the rear of the encampment, because they're sick with dysentery, they're sick with typhoid fever or one of these diseases. They're just too sick to make it there, right? So this is why they start adapting to having these pits dug more locally. And later, when they're inoculating the troops of smallpox, right, and then the men will be quarantined within their own huts, and they may be brought under guard, marched to the vault, or else just you know, watch over with a guard while they use you know, the local pits. So that is reflected here as well. In terms of some of the dimensions, the largest hut you see here is 12.5 feet by 12 feet. That's probably number 13. The reconstructed huts that we have at Muhlenberg's brigade today are on the right. So that gives you an idea of the size. I mean, some of these are a third or even a quarter the size of our reconstructed huts. 3 of these have corner fireplaces. The smallest hut is 7.5 feet by 6.5 feet. And number 16 doesn't even have a fireplace. My favorite one is number 8, this boot-shaped one. It just shows the irregularity in the shape of these huts. So this is part of a ground-penetrating radar survey where they uncovered this hut, and a photo after they excavated it. So this is at the M10 location, approximately, you know, where Muhlenberg's brigade is today, perhaps, or it may be Whedon's brigade, a little bit closer to that. But yeah, you can see that this is a hut with a very irregular shape. No stone foundations. They're going off of the discoloration in the soil from the logs that have rotted away. And yeah, that's what you see remaining. So, you know, when we look at the huts, you have to imagine a wider variety. Like, is this hut going to have a gabled roof? You know, I mean, it's not exactly easy to do. So I imagine like a lean-to style roof would probably make that turn a little bit easier. Any other questions?
Yep. What types of materials were used to pack between the logs?
Yeah. So there is the chinking is the word for the material packed between the logs. Clay is preferred. When they can't find that, they can use mud. You can mix that with straw. It's also clear that any small stones that they encounter when digging, those are being pushed into the joints as well. From the archaeological evidence, you do see some of those stones that turn up closer to where the walls are positioned. So you do see some accounts describing what they think are the stones that were packed into the chinking, but they're not using lime, right? They're not mixing anything like that, any kind of mortar, just mud. Clay is preferable. Yeah.
And why would hut alignment be different than shown in the paintings of the time?
Yeah. Well, the paintings are romanticized, and they're also based upon the written accounts. And the written accounts versus the archaeological evidence, you see this divergence. So sometimes we have our best guess, and our best guess originally is that they would follow the regimented castrumentation and organization of a military camp. But maybe there are areas where they were kind of digging around a stump. Maybe they dumped a bunch of logs and supplies, and you know, one platoon isn't willing to move them, and the other platoon are like, "Hey, move your stuff. My hut needs to go there." And they're like, "No, you know, go do your own thing," and they'll have to build their hut, you know, alongside it. So some of these huts may have just been built around stumps, built around dumped material, building material from other platoons. And, you know, I mean, they probably cooperated a great deal, but, you know, human nature being what it is, human differences might have prevented them from keeping, you know, building these in the locations they may have wanted to do. So, I mean, I really love looking at these Virginia Brigade archaeological dig schematics, because it just is revealing of potentially how haphazard it can be. We don't always see that, though. Again, Maxwell's brigade, very regimented. Here in Wayne's Woods, again, we see a greater regimentation and an organization of the huts. So this is close to, this pictured here from these 1966 excavations are close to Wayne's Monument. There were some future excavations that were done in these different locations. But again, you have the private soldiers, their huts are closer to the front. And to the rear of the encampment, you have the officers' huts. Here's another officers' area that was excavated. I'd like to point out that you do have this officer's hut with 2 fireplaces, 2 hearths, 2 chimneys, right? So it's going to be extra warm, right? You have 6 officers, so 2 captains, 2 first lieutenants, 2 second lieutenants, right? So those officers belonging to different companies, maybe each one had their own fireplace. So some of them are built larger, but they have twice as many hearths. So there are different variations to consider that are between officers' huts and private huts. Now, today, the reconstructed officers' hut at Muhlenberg Brigade, unfortunately, is put in line with the soldiers instead of to the rear of that line, as they would have at the time. Yeah, any other questions before we move on from some of the huts?
Nothing at this time.
Okay. Now, the dining hut is something a lot of people may be familiar with if you've taken tours of Washington's headquarters. And this was one dig in which they tried to locate that. And this is disrupted ground. There is about 2 feet of topsoil that was removed just to try and level this area. And if you think about that, there's a lot of archaeological evidence that may have been cut away from the original foundation. But there is this sill trench that it is the best guess of where the edge of the dining hut may have been built. So the dining hut, this was built to create extra dining space for Washington and his aides who are living in the headquarters building owned by Isaac Potts. At nighttime, this could also become extra sleeping space, probably has another chimney. And fireplace to keep it heated. And you're not going to let heated space go to waste. So the use of the space will probably change throughout the day. But this is the best guess of the approximate dimensions and locations of that dining hut. And there was a well that likely dates to the encampment period as well. So I thought people would be interested in seeing these items. Now, one thing you also see at Muhlenberg's brigade is the reconstructed bake oven. Unfortunately, early in the 20th century, the residents of the area and when this was a state park, people found what they believed to be bake ovens. And they reconstructed or restored these bake ovens. And they look something like this, covered with earth and so on. But what they actually did, they confused them with camp kitchens, right? So those sites in Wayne's Woods that were reconstructed and repurposed to be bake ovens, historically they were camp kitchens, which is a very different structure. So this is a reconstructed version. You can see a painting on the right-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the soldiers are the ones doing the cooking, right? Each mess group is responsible for cooking their own food, and that's the men. The men cook for themselves for the most part. Now, women may be helping out in a supporting role, but it is the responsibility of the men to do their own cooking. So, for Women's Equality Day, something to keep in mind, perhaps. But yeah, so this example of a camp kitchen, you dig a trench and you poke holes in the side of this wall and then a hole vertically. And when you build a hole or build a fire inside that hole, all that heat is directed upward. You've basically created a stove with a very directed fire. And this is very, very good in terms of conservation and insulation of heat. It's the most fuel efficient way of cooking at all. Most fuel efficient ways. So this is why the men were forbidden from cooking in the huts, and they were supposed to cook in the camp kitchens. So you would see an entire row of camp kitchens to the rear of the camp. And there are a few of them that have been uncovered at Washington's Memorial Chapel or in Wayne's Woods. And unfortunately, you know, again, these have been mistaken for the camp kitchens have been mistaken for the bake ovens. And that confusion exists even today. You know, there are images of camp kitchens and people mistake them for bake ovens and so on, but very different animals. Now, here are a few examples. The one on the right is an actual camp kitchen foundation from Washington's Memorial Chapel area, approximate location of Connecticut troops. And you can see that discoloration in the soil from, you know, that is how they see the difference between disturbed ground and that which isn't. I like this example from the left, Hampshire militia at Barton's Farm. This is in England. And you could see very well-defined trenches with these separate holes cut for those cook fires, right? And there'd be maybe 12 to 16 different mess groups or platoons that are cooking all the way around. A very efficient way of distributing men in cooking space. Now, what I also like about this picture is you could see beyond it, right? 2, 3, 4, you could see an entire row of those camp kitchens. Now, camp kitchens, again, the bake ovens, you know, we also know that there were bake ovens. The Continental Army needs to convert that flour to bread, right? Rather than just mix it into a paste with water and cook it onto a rock. You know, fire cake, it's not good for digestion. You're not getting all the nutrients you could if you had baked that into bread, right? So here we see on the left, bottom left, this is the remains of a bake oven at Fort Stanwix. On the right, this is the remain of a couple civilian bake ovens in Trenton, New Jersey, that were most likely co-opted by the Continental Army in 1776 and 1777. Now, these are more permanent bake ovens than you might have at Valley Forge. There were about 30 cast iron portable bake ovens that were distributed to the Continental Army. 20 large, 10 small. The last remaining 12 were issued out, I believe, in January of 1778, and they're issued out to the brigades at the brigade level. So while the Army baker, you know, Christopher Ludwig, you know, he and a number of professional bakers, these are men hired for the purpose of baking bread or hardtack for the Continental Army, they are likely across the Schuylkill River with the commissaries department. They may have built bake ovens there, but you have at each brigade these brigade bake ovens as well. And we don't know exactly what they look like, but this is the only surviving archaeological example of a brigade bake oven, a temporary one that we know of. Now this, again, was an early study. I believe this is in the 1970s, in which they uncovered this. They did not fully excavate this stone structure, as they called it, right? It's a stone structure. It's roughly 12.5 feet by 7 feet. They found some shards of a gray stoneware that they think is associated with it. And to the west of this structure, which is right here, close to where this arrow is, there is burnt clay. And so they have an idea that this is likely a bake oven structure, a stone structure. Unfortunately, they haven't excavated it fully, so we don't know the exact shape of this. I mean, a lot of these bake ovens are shaped similar to pizza ovens today, but if they had these cast iron sort of six-sided portable ovens, you know, with a door in the front, and you know, and a stovepipe in the back, you know, they may have built this stone structure around the cast iron portable bake ovens. And one thing lending to that idea is the fact that the burnt red clay up close, when they did magnetometry studies, data detecting, you know, whether there's a magnetic field, it appears as though it doesn't. The clay is no different than the surrounding soil. So they believe that it wasn't very strong fires on the clay itself, which if the heat was greater, it would be in an oven itself. So this clay, this might be where they're sweeping some of the ash and charcoal from the inside of some of those ovens into this area. This is my interpretation. Again, it's very difficult to decide what this may have looked like. This is one reconstruction that I created, the idea that you maybe have some kind of log structure that is building up the base. And because it's all rotted away and they didn't excavate it, we don't know if there was some base structure similar to this. The red clay in front, your portable cast iron bake ovens, and then you're building, a rock structure around it. So this is a reconstruction, best guess of what it may have looked like. But, if we go back to the mess shelter or the camp kitchens, Bennett Cuthbertson, he wrote a book called Economy of a Battalion. It's in 1768. It's a military manual, and he describes a covered mess shelter where they basically take long poles and build a conical structure above this, almost shaped like a teepee, and you weave green sticks between it like a wattle and daub almost, right, to create a structure that would surround this entire thing. So you can build a roof, a structure over a camp kitchen. We don't have any textual examples of this during the American Revolution, but we know it's something that they could have done at the time. So if they can cover, a camp kitchen, they could potentially cover a bake oven, right? What if there was a bake oven hut at the brigade level? We really don't know. This is kind of one of those enduring mysteries. It could have been built within a hut, and we have this rectangular shape. What if this, basically, when it was broken apart and, any of the wooden piece elements to it was rotted away? What if it collapsed into the cellar of a hut, with the Virginia brigades? If they dug down, at the floor of a hut, maybe, this bake oven collapsed into the cellar of a hut, and that is contributing to the rectangular shape that has been preserved as well. Open question, the reconstruction of bake ovens, this is something that is widely debated today. This is my best guess of what it may have looked like, with the intriguing possibility that this bake oven could be inside a purpose-built hut. Now, these get really hot during the summertime. In May of 1778, they actually gave orders to cut windows into the huts to keep these from becoming too humid, and to remove the chinking between the logs, right, to allow the air to go into this area.
We have some questions,
yeah,
Justin.
please.
Is there a reconstructed camp kitchen in Valley Forge Park?
There's not. And part of the difficulty is you need to archaeologically clear an area before you can create a reconstruction, because if you're going to build it, you have to disturb the soil. So if you were ever to reproduce one, which I would love to see, it would have to be done in coordination with the park archaeologists, and that work needs to be done first. Any other question?
Are the excavations preserved that you're showing?
Yes, they are underneath the ground. So this one in particular, this was never fully excavated. So they uncovered it, and then they put the topsoil right back over the top. So this is untouched. It's still below the ground. So if future archaeologists wanted to further explore this and determine what was there, they can. We can learn a little bit more about the bake oven with more archaeological work, but so far that has not been done.
What made the bread so nutritious, I guess, as compared to the hardtack?
Well, I mean, hardtack is going to be nutritious as well, but particularly when you create flour cakes or ash cakes, where you're just cooking flour paste on ashes or on a heated rock. It's it's not, you're not really breaking down, the elements very well. Yeah, it's just not easy to digest. And if you can't digest it easily, then it's passing through your digestive system before you can fully, absorb those nutrients. So that's essentially what it comes down to.
And we also have a couple of comments. There was a bakehouse in Torresdale in Philadelphia that supplied some of Washington's troops.
Mm-hmm.
And also a compliment to you, great engaging use of photo editing to let us visualize some of the possible variations of the Hudson ovens. Really neat.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I thought we'd have some fun with this.
Yep.
I do want to point out that with the speaker series that's upcoming, October 8th being the first one, because today's Women's Equality Day, it's appropriate that our first talk is on the women's suffrage movement. But if you're really interested in all this material, I really encourage you to look at this future talk by Stephen Elliott. He'll be a speaker in May of next year. And he wrote his dissertation on winter quarters of the Continental Army. And Valley Forge, he argues, was a key turning point, right? This was a moment in which they decide to build a log city, and they use that model in future winter encampments. So, he describes this as a really revolutionary moment in Continental Army strategy. So that's what his dissertation is based on. His book is coming out next year, and he will be one of our future speakers. Do we have any last questions?
There's one more question. How many excavations were done, and are there still some to be discovered?
But overall, there are, I don't know, a couple dozen different archaeological digs over the years. The 1960s and earlier. And the problem is there were not that good record. There was not good record keeping in the early 20th century. So a lot of these digs left behind very little evidence. In some cases, the surviving artifacts, from like the 1940s or 1950s explorations, those are gone. Some days we might have only a 1 or 2 page summary of an entire dig. You see these referenced in other publications. So we really don't know how many archaeological digs have been done, but yeah, there were some pretty impressive ones that were done most recently. And with the citations, I definitely recommend this this book. Let's see here. Yeah, Historical Archaeology of the Revolutionary War Encampments of Washington's Army. Chapters are also available on JSTOR if you want to look at that. But these are summarizing some of the most recent archaeological explorations, including Wayne's Woods, and those digs that were carried out at the Washington Memorial Chapel grounds, and also a firing range that was located pretty close to the administration building. So very interesting chapters in that book, which are worth looking at. Any other last questions? I think we're at about time.
Yep. Excellent talk with great graphics, and many thanks.
Quite welcome.
Coming through.
So thank you again for the opportunity. This has been fun.
Yep. On behalf of the Valley Forge Alliance and the Tredyffrin Libraries and the local historical societies, we thank you very much and look forward to the future presentations. Thank you, Justin.
I just want to add that digging for archaeological artifacts or looting, that is illegal and a felony offense. Archaeology is really key here at Valley Forge because the artifacts, when you uncover them, the position of the data, all that evidence is lost with any illegal looting. So again, please do not do that. Respect Valley Forge's resources and do not disturb our archaeological positions. Thank you.